Oscar Wilde thought that Adam Lindsay Gordon was the greatest poet, the greatest Antipodean poet, and indeed there is a plaque to him in Westminster Cathedral. And one of his most famous poems survives like Kipling's If. He wrote, "Life is mainly," and you probably had this quoted to you in your childhood, "life is mainly froth and bubble, two things stand like stone, kindness in another's trouble, courage in your own." Oscar Wilde, in reviewing an early Australian anthology, gave a withering judgment, generally, but he liked Gordon. He described Australian versifiers as, quotes, "poets who lay under the shade of the gum tree, gather wattle blossoms and butterwong and sarsaparilla for their loves, and wander through the glades of Mount Baw Baw, listening to the careless raptures of the mopoke." Wilde did, however, have regard for Kendall and Lindsay Gordon. The interesting battle that was in progress was between, in northern Australia, was between the numerous tribes up there and the pastoralists. And like in the American West, it was a battle for water resources, water holes. One of the most interesting people up there who wrote his memoirs was a cop called Wiltshire. Now, in those days, there was no coast-to-coast Aboriginal solidarity. And so the authorities recruited Aboriginals from down along the Murray River on either side, New South Wales and Victoria, and they took them up into far north Australia as mounted troopers. And they gave them fast-loading repeater rifles. And they helped with the massacre of their own people up there. Not everyone was a monster to Aboriginal people. Some pastoralists were known as safe ground. And as well as that, the missions served as, despite their rather intolerant attitude to Aboriginal ceremonial, they served as a place where people could shelter from the pastoralists who felt they had a right to the land. After every Aboriginal outrage, the spearing of 2 miners at Pine Creek, the spearing of cattle, the killing of a stock rider, there was obviously a disproportionate response because our side had those weapons that the Aboriginals didn't have. Wiltshire was one of the enforcers, therefore, of Aboriginal discipline in northern Australia, a man of physical courage and psychological sturdiness. He had written in an eloquent when chasing, about chasing mischievous local, as he called them, local natives of the north, he spoke of his group's weapons, rifles, talking English to the silent majesty of those great eternal rocks, which is the fanciest way of saying mowing them down that you could come across. His memoirs read deplorably now. They're a petri dish of noxious attitudes, but they were presented to the gaze of his generation in the confidence that they would be enthusiastically applauded. Given the realities of remote Australia and the war Indigenes were fighting to retain land sites, there is no reason to doubt Wiltshire when he asserts that many sleepless nights and weary anxious days have been gone through in doing duty among wild tribes who during the writing of this book committed murders and killed the settlers' horses and cattle, and the author being a police officer in charge of native constables, and those acts being exigencies of the service, he had to go through out with his trackers and deal with each case respectively as the law provided. The lamentations and the tears that he said belonged to the mothers of those killed, and it was a frontier war, and men and women were killed. The lamentations he sees as being only on the white side. O sorrowing, mothers and sisters true, your sons and brothers' bones lay bleaching in scenes of wildest desolation and in scenes of picturesque beauty at various waterholes on the overland telegraph line, at dozens of places in the Northern Territory, especially its rivers. There is no denying that individual travellers or small parties had reason to be fearful of attack. Patrolling the Catherine, Daly, Gregory, Roper and Victoria rivers in the mid-1880s, Wiltshire claims he did not know when he lay down at night when the attack would come. And if this is so, it could not have added to his kindly thoughts. According to him, the marauding natives often sheltered between murders at mission stations, now beginning to spread across the north, run by Trappist monks. Can you imagine being a Trappist monk in the Northern Territory in the 19th century? Run by Trappist monks, Presbyterians, Jesuits, all of whom he mocked. Their attack made, he said, Aboriginals then retreated, reassuming the garments of the mission and its pieties. His energy was deployed by contrast as missionary of the carbine, and he was relentless in spreading that light. And I then go on to talk about a number of massacres in which he was involved. World War I, I tried to tell from a new angle. And instead of telling the normal frontal account of battles, although I tried to do so, maybe from the point of view of individual soldiers, I thought a good way of looking at World War I would be to look at the wounds and the nurses and the stretcher bearers. So I gathered a lot of journals of stretcher bearers and nurses. And I ended up writing a novel about nurses that's coming out next year, published by a much better publisher, isn't it, Louise, from Allen and Unwin? A publisher called Random House. Here is, the nurses are interesting because they're early cases of women laying down a challenge to the male military establishment. And a lot of them were not treated as heroes by the establishment, as this proves. In fact, a Captain Deacon, not related to the medical officer, not related to Alfred Deakin, the Prime Minister, or to Vera Deakin, his daughter, who ran an extraordinary casualty office in London, from which she found out precisely what happened to Blakes, how they died, whether they'd been captured, and she was a darling to the families in Australia, and the military hated her, of course. They'd rather just send a telegram. Captain Deakin was a medical officer, and he wrote in December 1916, all the nursing had been performed by our male orderlies, who by this time had become expert nurses and could give hypodermic injections and bowel washouts as well as any nurse. Deakin's confidence in an all-male staff is contradicted by a woman called Sister Maurice. She says that on arrival at Lemnos in September 1915, now Lemnos was an island off Gallipoli, and that's where the wounded were sent increasingly as the Gallipoli campaign ground on. She says that on arrival on Lemnos in September, the nurses found men, looked after by orderlies, lying on muddy mattresses on the ground, and that dysentery patients were forced to hobble outside, dressed only in their night clothes, to use commodes in the icy wind. And the medical commandant, who was a bloke that the British Army had offloaded on us because they knew he was crazy, the British medical officer in charge of this hospital thought it stopped malingering. If they had to go outside with dysentery to reach the latrines, it sorted out the malingerers from the genuinely ill. It did not take the sisters long, says Nellie Maurice, to get the beds raised. We kept the men in bed and ordered that bedpans should be given to them. The Australian nurses were also aware that the nurses in the Canadian hospitals nearby were paid more and better treated and appreciated. And to be efficient, they therefore needed to battle their resentment about that. As the autumn came on, heavy dews attacked the fabric of the tents and penetrated the canvas walls to the extent that sisters had to huddle in the same cot for warmth. Gales swept over the island for the whole autumn, creating cold sandstorms. The book lacked warm clothing, and Colonel Featherston, acting director of medical services for Australia, ordered that they were to have proper clothing, even if it was male, gumboots, trousers, and warm clothes. Featherston cabled back to Melbourne that the women would break down if their situation wasn't improved, and that, quotes, if the sisters were not better treated, he would take them off the island. Occasionally, they'd be invited on an Australian or British or Canadian ship and be given tea, and they loved that. And the men from a local Australian artillery unit that was resting on Lemnos brought them hampers over and created a world of kindness. Well, as you know, men are always after something if they bring a hamper, but nonetheless, they created a world of kindness that wasn't there in the hospital where they were looking after the shell shock, the wounded, grievous wounds, and grievous disease. Their hospital was supposed to contain 240 patients. It contained 1,000. And ultimately, all these women went on to France after the extraordinary evacuation of Gallipoli. You know, that was the campaign was a write-off, but a terrible slaughter. But the evacuation of Gallipoli without the Turks finding out was extraordinary. And I tell the story of the last medical unit, the last Australian clearing station left on Gallipoli. They were going to surrender to the Turks the next morning when the Turks realized the trenches were empty. And they got even them off, the last 500 off. So it was, in a way, a triumph of war or of not having a war. The book ends with the outrageous baiting by little Billy Hughes, our Welsh-born Prime Minister, of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson and Hughes's determination to get mandates, to create a sort of Monroe Doctrine in the Pacific, to get control of the fringe of islands. And Japan, who was our ally in World War I, trying to get mandates over the Caroline and Marshall Islands. You know, all without asking the natives. That's the way the things were done there. And Hughes wanted to maintain white Australia, so he fought Woodrow Wilson over a racial equality clause in the peace treaty. Secretly, the Americans didn't want it either, but they let Hughes seem to be the bad man who denied the Japanese the racial equality clause.